It all started with a clock. Not a digital one, but the old kind tick-tock, brass hands, glass dome, worn wood casing, resting on a dusty shelf inside a tucked-away antique bookstore on the edge of old Pasadena. Elon had wandered in alone, disguised in a hoodie and worn sneakers, trying to escape the weight of expectation and the digital roar of his life for just one afternoon. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, maybe a forgotten sci-fi novel or a strange physics manuscript to distract his mind. But what he found instead was a small, unassuming piece of time that would unravel the very fabric of his reality. The store smelled like cedar and memories. Faint jazz played from a record that crackled with age. Shelves stretched high and narrow, bending under the weight of time itself. A frail woman at the counter gave him a nod without recognition, and that in itself was a gift. It wasn't often he could be invisible. He was reaching for a copy of Letters to a Young Scientist when something shimmered behind the shelf. A pulse, a flicker, like a heat wave bending light, except it was cooler than air. Elon blinked, shook his head, and looked again. Nothing, just books and silence. But when he turned back toward the clock that had caught his eye a minute before, it was no longer ticking. It was humming. Drawn to it, Elon picked it up. It buzzed faintly in his hands, like it had swallowed electricity or remembered storm. On its underside, carved into the wood, was a symbol he hadn't seen in any physics textbook or SpaceX schematic. An interlocking set of concentric circles with a line broken in the middle, clean, almost surgically precise. He pressed it without thinking. The world popped. Not exploded, not vanished, just popped, like a soap bubble. And suddenly, he wasn't in the bookstore anymore. The air was colder, cleaner. The light had a strange bluish hue, like dawn remembered wrong. Elon stood in what appeared to be a parlor. Ornate furniture, oil paintings, and a grand window through which he saw horses trotting by, and people in top hats and long dresses walking with umbrellas, though the sun was out. Then he heard it, the voice. "You're not supposed to be here. Not yet." Elon spun around. Albert Einstein stood before him. Not as a statue, not as a ghostly hologram, not as a dusty photograph, but as a man. Flesh and blood, wild white hair, warm hazel eyes. A faint smile danced on his lips, not one of welcome, but one of recognition laced with confusion. "Do I know you?" Einstein asked, stepping closer, cautious but not fearful. Elon's mouth opened, but no words came. His brain, brilliant, burning, built to understand rockets and revolutions, struggled to make sense of the impossibility before him. "I think we're about to," Elon finally replied. The silence between them was thick, not awkward, but loaded with potential. Two minds, centuries apart, tethered now by something neither yet understood. Einstein motioned toward a chair. "You look like you could use tea. Or a theory." Elon sat, still holding the clock, now dead silent, in his hands. "What year is it?" 1933, Einstein said, pouring from silver pot. "But that's not your question, is it?" Elon laughed quietly. No, it's not." They sat together in that quiet room, and for a moment, time itself forgot to tick. Einstein stared into his teacup as if the surface might answer the question neither of them dared to ask yet. Across from him, Elon sat with the strange brass clock resting on his lap, like a key he hadn't meant to turn. The silence between them was not tense, it was alive. It carried weight, like the space between stars, full of gravity and possibility. "I've seen your face," Einstein said suddenly, his German accent softened by age. "On magazines and newspapers, but the name eludes me." "Elon Musk," he replied slowly, as if saying it out loud might make the situation more real. "I run companies. Space travel, electric cars, artificial intelligence, that kind of thing." Einstein chuckled. "You are a man who lives in many futures at once, then." Elon tilted his head. "That's one way to put it. And yet, you've walked into my past." Curious. It wasn't just the strangeness of where Elon had landed that rattled him. It was how familiar it all felt. The room, the man across from him, even the scent of the tea. like some deeply coded part of him had always known this encounter would happen. "I have a theory," Elon said, still gripping the clock. "I think this is real. Not a dream. Not a simulation. Somehow I've shifted in time." Einstein's eyes lit up, not with surprise, but with something older and more reverent. "Wonder. Good. Then we are on the same page. That makes two of us, and two minds are better than one, even if one of them comes from a future I cannot imagine." Elon leaned forward. "Actually, I think you can imagine it. You already did. You laid the foundations for most of what we build now. Relativity, quantum uncertainty, energy-matter equivalence. You cracked open the universe." Einstein waved the compliment off with a modest hand. "Equations are simple things. The heart behind them is what matters. Most people forget that. Even scientists. Especially scientists." That hit Elon harder than expected. He'd spent years optimizing systems, measuring margins, tweaking numbers. But behind every leap forward, SpaceX launches, Tesla's energy breakthroughs, Neuralink's strange dance with consciousness, there had always been a tug he couldn't explain. Something unmeasured. Something emotional. "I didn't come here on purpose," Elon said, "but maybe purpose brought me here." Einstein smiled faintly pleased. "Now that sounds like a physicist." They sat for a long moment drinking tea, as if their conversation were older than the room itself. Outside, the sound of distant clopping hooves and laughter in German echoed faintly through the window, as if to remind them that they were out of time, but not out of place. "What are you afraid of?" Einstein asked suddenly. Elon blinked. "That's a big question." "Then give it a big answer." He hesitated. He could have said the world collapsing under climate change, or AI spinning out of control, or losing people he loved because he'd buried himself in work. But all of that felt like surface fear. What he actually felt was deeper, older. "I'm afraid that I'll keep building things faster than people can understand them, that I'll outrun our humanity." Einstein nodded, his eyes solemn. "The future always runs ahead of the soul. Our job as thinkers is to slow it down just enough that people can walk beside it. And what if they can't? Then we wait," Einstein said softly, "or we walk with them." That silence returned, this time a bomb, not a void. "Do you want to know something?" Elon said after a while. "Always. I've read your letters, the ones you wrote to your son, your students, even the ones people weren't supposed to publish. You were never just a scientist. You were trying to hold on to something deeper. Kindness, intuition, love." Einstein smiled sadly. "Love is the only thing worth accelerating." Outside, the wind shifted. The shimmer that had once brought Elon through seemed to pulse faintly at the edge of the room. Not a threat, just a reminder. Time never stops moving, even when it folds. "Why do you think you were brought here?" Einstein asked. "I'm not sure," Elon said, "but maybe it wasn't about physics. Maybe it was about remembering how to be human." Einstein set his teacup down with care. "Then we should walk. Walk. Walk with me. Talk with me. Let's see what happens when two men from different centuries think together, not with machines, but with their hearts." Elon stood. The clock didn't buzz this time. It was still as if listening. As they stepped outside into the cobbled street, the world around them bloomed with soft light, like reality itself was leaning in to listen. And you, dear viewer, you're still here. That means something. So here's the deal. We won't break the spell with a flashy button or a shouty pitch. But if this story's pulling at your chest, if you're feeling something real in this meeting of minds, subscribe. Not just because it helps the channel, but because we're building something together here. Something beautiful, and your presence makes it real. Now, let's return to the story. The sky above them stretched wide and unhurried, like a canvas smeared with early afternoon light. The street was cobbled, each stone worn by decades of quiet passage. There were no honking horns, no flashing signs, no screens battling for attention. Just the rhythmic tapping of Einstein's leather shoes and the softer tread of Elon's sneakers as they walked side by side. The world around them was slow and gentle, a kind of temporal bomb neither of them realized they needed until now. Einstein walked with his hands clasped behind his back, a habit Elon had only ever seen in old photographs. It made him seem smaller, somehow more reflective than the mythical figure history often made him. Beside him, Elon kept glancing around, studying the ornate gas lamps, the signs in Gothic script, the horse-drawn carts in the distance. Everything was still but not frozen. It was alive with purpose. "You walk like a man carrying the weight of 1,000 futures," Einstein said, not looking at him. "And you speak like a man who already made peace with the past," Elon replied, half smiling. Einstein stopped in front of a bench and sat, brushing his coat gently before doing so. Elon followed. From here, they had a view of the river winding through the edge of the city, reflecting the sky like melted glass. "I used to sit here and think," Einstein said, "before the war, before the letters, before they made me into something I'm not." Elon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What do you mean?" "I mean they turned me into a symbol, a poster, a mask. The truth is, people don't want their geniuses human. They want them flawless, even if they're lonely." That word hit Elon like a punch in the chest. He hadn't expected to hear it from Einstein. Not from the man who redefined the universe. But the way he said it, not dramatic, not self-pitying, just honest, it rang true in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar. "You too?" Elon asked softly. Einstein nodded. "They want the ideas, the breakthroughs, but not the contradictions, not the doubt. They don't want to know that I was afraid sometimes, or that I didn't understand the consequences of some of what I discovered. They want the mind, not the man." Elon stared at the ground. "That hasn't changed." Einstein looked at him now, eyes sharpening with interest. "Tell me." Elon took a breath, then let out slowly. "I've spent years trying to push humanity forward, trying to make sure we survive, colonize Mars, create sustainable energy, build systems that make us more efficient, more aware, more connected. But the more I do, the more disconnected I feel. Like I'm running ahead and looking back, and everyone's still walking in circles." "You've become a lighthouse," Einstein said gently. "But a lighthouse is always alone." Elon blinked. That was it. That was the feeling he hadn't found words for. Einstein continued, "You are not wrong to run ahead. Some minds are built for it. But don't forget to stop and rest. Don't forget to turn the light inward, even if only for a while." Elon looked out at the river, watching a pair of swans drift lazily past. "Sometimes I wonder if I've gone too far, if I've pulled us into something we weren't ready for." "Maybe," Einstein said, "but progress is not a clean road. It is muddy and cracked and full of turns. Even a stumble forward is still forward." They sat in silence again, but this one felt different. It wasn't heavy, it was shared, comfortable, like sitting beside a fire after a long day of thinking too much. Elon turned to him. "Did you ever once stop?" "Every day," Einstein answered without hesitation. "But I didn't. Not because I was brave, but because I was curious." That made Elon laugh, and Einstein joined him. It felt good, human. For a moment, they were not legends, not icons. They were just two men who had seen too much and still had too many questions. "Have you ever loved something so much it scared you?" Elon asked. Einstein looked surprised. He looked down at his hands for a long time. "Yes," he said eventually. "My violin, my theories, a few people, and once the idea of peace. I loved it so much that I feared the world would never want it as badly as I did." "And did it?" Elon asked. Einstein sighed. "Not always, but love is never wasted, even when it goes unheard." Elon nodded. "There's this phrase I heard once. What you build is not as important as how you make people feel while you're building it." I didn't understand it at first. Now I think I do. Einstein smiled. "Good, because that might be the most important lesson of all." As the wind picked up, the shimmer returned faintly in the air beside them, like a curtain of light barely visible unless you looked directly at it. But neither of them acknowledged it. "Not yet. I don't know how long I have here," Elon said. Time is flexible, Einstein replied, but meaning is not. So speak your heart while you can. And so he did. Elon talked about the nights alone at his factories, the fear that his children wouldn't understand him, the weight of billions in public pressure, the way he sometimes wished he could go back and just be a boy building rockets in his backyard. And Einstein listened not as a scientist, not even as a mentor, but as someone who had once carried that very same ache. I think I was brought here, Elon said, not to understand something new, but to remember something old. Einstein reached over, placing a hand on his shoulder. Then let's remember it together. And as the river moved and the world stayed slow, the two men, one from the past, one from the future, sat with their hearts exposed in the center of time. They walked again, slow and silent at first, but with a rhythm that felt natural. Two minds syncing, not in terms of logic or mathematics, but in something older, more visceral. Like two branches of the same tree finally recognizing their common root. The air held that crisp clarity particular to early spring, where each breath carried the faint sweetness of renewal and the soft crackle of change. Einstein's coat flapped slightly in the breeze, and Elon, still holding the clock, noticed for the first time just how light the object had become. It no longer buzzed. It simply rested in his hands, as though it too were listening. They turned down a narrow lane, with ivy climbing the brick walls on either side. It led them to a modest courtyard. There was a fountain at the center, gurgling softly, and stone benches that looked like they had heard centuries of conversation. Einstein motioned for Elon to sit, and then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather notebook. I write things down, Einstein said. Not always equations, sometimes thoughts that have nowhere else to go. He handed the notebook to Elon without hesitation. It felt like receiving a sacred relic. Elon opened to a random page. There were sketches, some abstract, some formulaic, but in the margins were sentences that gripped him harder than the math ever could. Truth, like light, blinds. Falsehood, on the other hand, is a beautiful twilight that enhances every object. Elon looked up. You wrote this. Einstein nodded. After the Treaty of Versailles, I was disillusioned with how people twisted ideas to justify hate. I thought perhaps beauty could be found in falsehood if it brought comfort. But I was wrong. Comfort is not clarity. Elon closed the notebook and handed it back carefully. I get that. People think I'm trying to build a better world, and I am. But sometimes I think they just want a more comfortable illusion. They want progress without pain, change without cost. Einstein tucked the notebook away. The mind loves comfort, but the heart seeks meaning. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the fountain filling the space between them. Elon thought about how many conversations he'd had that felt like transactions, status updates, negotiations. But this was something else entirely. This was the first time in a long time that someone had asked him to go deeper than strategy or innovation. To feel, not just think. Einstein broke the silence. Let me ask you a question, Elon. Not about the future, about your past. What do you regret? The word stung, not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. Elon leaned back and let the weight of the question settle in. He thought of all the decisions, all the risks, all the moments when something inside him whispered, this is going to cost you. I regret forgetting what joy feels like when it has no agenda, he said finally. When I was a kid, building things wasn't about market impact or investor calls. It was just magic. I miss that magic. Einstein nodded slowly. The greatest minds I've known were not the most efficient. They were the most enchanted. Elon smiled at that. You know, people think I'm obsessed with Mars, with leaving Earth behind. But really, I'm just trying to create a space where we can begin again. Not escape, evolve. Einstein said, but can one evolve without first remembering what it means to simply be? The question hovered in the air, like an unanswered prayer. Elon turned the clock in his hands, inspecting the grooves, the gears. You ever think about what it means to leave a legacy? Einstein didn't answer right away. He seemed to consider the weight of the word. Legacy is a story others tell themselves about who you were. But the truth? The truth is what you carry in the quiet when no one's looking. That sounds lonely. It is, Einstein said, but only if you forget that being remembered is not the same as being known. Elon looked at him, eyes narrowing. And did they ever truly know you? Not really, Einstein admitted. They knew the hair, the equations, the rebellion, but not the man who wept when his marriage crumbled, or the father who failed to reach his own son, or the pacifist who begged the world not to build bombs from his math. Elon sat still, the weight of those words pressing against his ribs. I'm scared of that, he said, that they'll remember the tweets, the rockets, but not the nights I stayed up worrying about whether my kids would still recognize me 10 years from now. Einstein placed a hand on Elon's shoulder. Then you must make room for them now. Not later, not after the next project. Now, but the world. The world will wait, Einstein said gently, but your children won't. Elon didn't respond right away. He just nodded once slowly, as if promising something not just to Einstein but to himself. A gust of wind swept through the courtyard, rustling the ivy, and the shimmer appeared again, closer this time, brighter. It bent the air slightly, like heat rising from pavement, but with an inner light that seemed almost conscious. It's coming back, Elon said, his voice soft. Yes, Einstein replied, but don't fear it. It's not the end. It's a doorway. To what? To whatever you're ready to remember, Einstein said. The two men stood. Neither offered goodbye. It didn't feel necessary. The moment had already said everything that words could not. As Elon stepped toward the shimmer, he turned back one last time. What should I tell them? The ones waiting for answers back home. Einstein smiled. Tell them the most advanced civilization is the one most willing to love. Then, with a final nod, Elon stepped through. The shimmer closed around Elon like mist at first, cool and soundless, then pulled tight, like the closing of an eyelid. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Not out of pain or fear, but because time itself felt thick, like syrup rushing over his skin, blurring every edge of sensation. The world had no floor, no up or down, just a drifting awareness that he was between places, between selves. And then air, light, the quiet hum of fluorescent bulbs overhead, the distinct smell of old books mixed with leather and citrus polish. He was back in the antique bookstore. The clock was still in his hands, unmoving now. Silent, just a relic again. Just a beautiful, strange object on a shelf no one had touched in decades. But he was not the same. Elon looked around slowly, half expecting the world to feel wrong. Too small, too digital. But instead, everything felt sharper, more intimate. The wooden floor under his feet, the weight of the clock in his lap. Even the dust in the air looked like stardust now. Like every particle had a story. He stood up slowly, moved through the quiet aisles with reverence, as if walking through a museum of his former life. The woman at the counter was still there, eyes half closed behind cat-eye glasses, completely unaware that the man before her had just had tea with Einstein. Find what you were looking for, she asked, not looking up. I found something, Elon said. Not what I thought, but something that mattered more. She hummed in approval, not really listening. He left the store with the clock still under his arm. Nobody stopped him. No alarms went off. It was as if the universe itself had decided, this is yours now. Not as a possession, but as a reminder. The sun was higher now, casting sharper shadows. The noise of Pasadena had returned, low and rolling. Cars, conversations, wind. Elon walked without direction, letting his feet choose, because his mind was too full. The encounter with Einstein had unsettled something deep in him, not in a disruptive way, but like tilling a garden you didn't know had soil underneath. All those years of building, chasing, defending, explaining, what was it all for if not to remember how to live before forgetting became the default? He ended up at a park. Not a futuristic green space with solar benches and AI-powered recycling bins, but an old park. The kind with creaky swings and peeling benches and pigeons that never leave. He sat, let the weight of the clock rest beside him. watched a child chase a bubble that floated just out of reach. The look on her face, a mix of hope, strategy, and pure instinct, reminded him of himself as a boy. He used to chase ideas like that, with joy, not pressure. Einstein's words came back, "The mind loves comfort, but the heart seeks meaning." For years, Elon had thought the two were the same. That meaning was found in pushing the mind to its limit. That purpose was the reward for relentless effort. And maybe in part it was, but sitting there, he realized he had forgotten the simplest rule of all. What we do only matters if we remember why we do it. He thought of his children, not as photos on his desk, not as names he kept out of the press, but as people, tiny galaxies of emotion, curiosity, confusion. People who needed not just a visionary for a father, but a witness. Someone who saw them in their ordinary moments and still found it extraordinary. He thought of his mother's hands, aging now, of the first time he sat in front of a computer screen and thought, "I can build a world here," of the long nights at the Tesla factory where he fell asleep on a couch because there was no time to go home. And he thought of Einstein, sitting across from him, calm as water, offering not answers but permission. Permission to slow down, to feel, to remember. Elon pulled a pen from his pocket, an old habit for meetings where he still liked to sketch instead of type. On the back of a folded receipt, he wrote, "The world doesn't need more products. It needs more presence." He stared at the words for a long time. Then, for the first time in what felt like years, he put his phone on airplane mode. Not as a statement, not as rebellion, but as an offering. He would go home, he decided. No diversions, no extra stops. Just home. He'd cook something himself. Sit with his kids without an agenda. Ask them questions and listen to the answers. And he'd talk to them, not as Elon Musk, titan of industry, but as a man who once had tea with a physicist and came back to Earth with a softer heart. The world would keep spinning. Rockets would still launch. Markets would still swing. But tonight, he would be still. And the next morning, he would begin again, not to escape Earth, not to colonize Mars, but to build something even harder, a future that feels like home. The evening sky was beginning to hint at twilight as Elon returned home. The clock, still tucked safely under his arm, had become more than just an artifact. It was a symbol now of something broken and sacred, something remembered. The brass still shone with an aged luster, and every time he looked at the delicate hands paused mid-movement, he saw more than time. He saw Einstein's eyes, the way they looked through him instead of at him. Not judging, not measuring, just understanding. He passed through his front gate and up the steps of his house, a place that had always felt more like a docking station than a home. But tonight, it felt different. He noticed the worn edge of the welcome mat, the little crack in the third step, the faint smell of cinnamon from the kitchen where someone had baked something warm and possibly from scratch. It wasn't luxury that struck him, it was life. And he felt its pulse more clearly now. The house was quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was waiting. He walked past the hallway filled with framed sketches from his kids. One of them had drawn a rocket shaped like a whale. Another was just 3 stick figures under a lopsided sun, labeled Me, Dad, and the Future. He paused in front of that one longer than he meant to. Then he went to the living room, set the clock gently on the coffee table, and sat down on the couch, not to check emails, not to review launch timelines, but simply to be there. A minute later, he heard the soft shuffle of footsteps. His youngest, Leo, peeked around the corner, holding a blanket in one hand and a half-eaten banana in the other. "You're home early," Leo said. Elon smiled. "I guess I am." Leo walked over, climbed onto the couch, and tucked himself under his dad's arm like he'd done 1,000 times. But tonight, Elon actually felt it, the small weight, the heartbeat, the sacred now. "What's that?" Leo asked, pointing at the clock. "It's a very old clock," Elon said. "It stopped ticking, but I think it still works." "Why doesn't it tick then?" Elon considered the question. "Maybe it's waiting for the right moment." Leo nodded like that made perfect sense and rested his head on Elon's shoulder. "Did you work today?" "I did something better," Elon said. Like what? I talked to someone who reminded me that life isn't just about building. It's about feeling. Leo looked up, slightly confused but interested. Feeling like happy? Yes. Happy. And sad. And scared. And amazed. That's a lot. It is, Elon said. But it's worth it. They sat in silence for a while. The kind of silence that makes room for breathing. That allows the dust to settle into something sacred. Elon thought about Einstein again, not the scientist, but the man. The one who had lived with contradictions. The one who had found clarity not in formulas, but in presence. What struck Elon most wasn't the genius. It was the gentleness. He thought of that courtyard, the ivy walls, the fountain. The question Einstein had asked him, "What do you regret?" It was a question that kept echoing, not to shame him, but to soften him. Because regret wasn't an anchor. It was a compass. And it was pointing home. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, and the house was still, Elon returned to the clock. He sat across from it, almost like it was a person. And for a long time, he simply watched it. Then, without really knowing why, he placed both hands on either side of it and closed his eyes. There was no shimmer, no light, just warmth. And then, a voice, not loud, not outside, but inside. "You are not alone." Elon's eyes snapped open. The room looked the same. The clock hadn't moved, but something inside him had. The voice wasn't Einstein's. Not exactly. It was older, quieter. The part of him he hadn't listened to in years. The part that remembered why he fell in love with the stars in the first place. Not because they were distant, but because they were full of wonder. He laughed. Not loudly, not sarcastically, just a soft, tired laugh. Like exhaling an old burden. Then the clock ticked. Once. Just once. And Elon knew he wasn't done with the world. But he was done trying to fix it without feeling it first. He picked up his phone, not to check messages, but to send one. A name from years ago. A physicist he'd once admired, then dismissed. Someone more poetic than practical. Elon had always seen that as a flaw. Now he saw it as a gift. Message. "Hey, I was wrong about you. I think we should talk. Over tea. No agenda." He hit send, turned the phone face down, and walked out to the backyard. The sky was clear. The stars familiar. But tonight, they didn't feel like a destination. They felt like a reminder. The next morning came with an unusual stillness. Elon awoke before the sun, not with the jolt of urgency that usually launched him from bed, but with a kind of quiet permission. The house was still asleep, the world not yet awake. There was something sacred in that, an untouched hour before the noise began. He moved slowly, barefoot across cool floors, letting his breath lead the way rather than his thoughts. No alerts, no headlines, no fires to put out. Just breath, just presence. The mantel clock, now on his nightstand, caught the first light of dawn and shimmered faintly in gold. He hadn't touched it since last night. But this morning, it almost looked different, no longer just a relic, but a kind of companion. It didn't tick. It didn't demand. It simply existed. Much like the memory of Einstein himself, quiet, steady, and impossibly alive. Elon sat beside the clock, an open notebook. A blank one. No grid paper, no engineering drafts. Just white pages. Empty space. He stared at it, pen in hand, and did something he hadn't done in years. He journaled. Not about strategy, not about timelines, but about feeling. About the weight that had lifted. About the strange sense of clarity that now followed him like a shadow. He wrote about Einstein, the courtyard, the walk, the way the old man's voice had wrapped around his fears like a blanket and warmed them instead of trying to erase them. And then he wrote something he hadn't expected. "I miss him. I didn't know I could miss someone I only just met." The words stopped him. They didn't feel like metaphor. They felt like truth. And then a deeper realization bloomed like ink in water. It wasn't just Einstein he missed. It was who he had been in Einstein's presence. Because for the first time in a long time, Elon had felt completely seen, not for his accomplishments, not for his controversies, not for his ambition, but for his humanity. For the boy who once sat in the dark, building circuits from scraps, imagining futures that no one else dared to speak aloud. Einstein hadn't needed to understand his companies to understand him, and that, more than any equation, had shifted something fundamental in his core. By the time his kids woke up, Elon had already made pancakes. From scratch. Leo padded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, surprised. "You cooked?" he asked. "I did," Elon said, flipping one with comical exaggeration. "Are they edible?" "We'll find out." They ate at the kitchen table, not the marble island where quick breakfasts usually happened, but the wooden one near the window that still had tiny crayon marks from a long-forgotten drawing session. They didn't talk about work or school or schedules. They talked about dreams, last nights, next year's, impossible ones. "Can you build a rocket that plays music while it launches?" Leo asked between bites. "Technically, yes," Elon said. "Can you make one that sings to the stars?" Elon paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "I think that's the best idea I've heard in years." Leo beamed. "Then do it." And Elon promised, not with the performative assurance of a CEO trying to impress a board, but with the sincerity of a father who now understood the value of saying yes to the wonder of a child. Later that day, after the morning rush had settled, Elon returned to his study and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in over a year. Inside were letters, old ones. Some typed, some scribbled. Correspondences with engineers, astronauts, even school children. But one envelope in particular caught his eye. It was handwritten, yellowed at the edges, addressed simply. To Elon, from someone who still believes. He didn't remember ever reading it. Carefully, he opened it. Inside was a single page, written in looping cursive. "Dear Elon, I know the world sees your mind. I hope one day it sees your heart. What you build will not last forever, but how you made people feel, that will." There was no signature. Elon stared at the letter for a long time. He turned it over. Nothing else. Just that quiet truth, sent by someone who understood what Einstein had said all along. The mind may build bridges, but the heart is what makes people cross them. It was then that he decided to do something unprecedented. He would take a week off. Not to travel, not to hide, but to be with his kids, with himself, with the parts of his life that had become background noise in the symphony of ambition. He messaged his assistant, "Cancel everything for the next 7 days. No exceptions. I'm unplugging. It's time." There was a flurry of confused replies, then quiet acceptance. He smiled. That evening, as the house settled again into silence, Elon returned to the mantle clock. It still hadn't ticked again, but he no longer needed it to. He understood now that some things don't move because they're waiting, not to be fixed, but to be felt. He whispered into the room, not expecting an answer, but needing to say it anyway. "Thank you." Then he turned off the lights, sat with his son again, and watched the stars, not to map a trajectory to Mars, but to remember why they had called to him in the first place. The clock didn't tick again. Not the next day, nor the one after. But that was no longer a concern. Elon had stopped waiting for it to do something. He had, perhaps for the first time in decades, accepted the idea that some of the most meaningful things in life didn't move, they remained. The mantle clock had become a still point in a turning world. It didn't count hours. It held them, preserved them, reminded him. By day 3 of his self-imposed retreat, the shift in him was no longer subtle. It was seismic. His team had stopped calling. His assistants had learned to redirect urgent matters. Even the ever-churning media cycle seemed to glance past him for a moment, as though the entire world had quietly agreed. Let the man be. Elon's home, which had once been more of a terminal than a sanctuary, began to breathe. There were open windows, unstructured conversations, long breakfasts that rolled lazily into afternoons. Leo laughed more. The walls echoed less. The silence, which used to be a signal that something had gone wrong, had transformed into something sacred. Silence was no longer absence. It was presence, patiently dressed in stillness. And within that silence, Elon began to remember things. Not memories exactly, but emotions wrapped around moments that had never been unpacked. The first time he heard a rocket engine roar and felt fear instead of triumph. The night he slept on the floor of the factory and wondered if he had become the machine. The time he stood on stage, triumphant, but felt nothing but cold in his chest. These weren't failures. They were unspoken truths. And in Einstein's quiet, timeless companionship, however brief or mystical, it was like the dam had finally cracked. He found himself walking more, not to burn calories, but to listen to his own thoughts. He wandered streets he'd never noticed in his own neighborhood. He stopped to watch birds land and take off again. He paused by a small park bench outside a used bookstore and, on impulse, walked in, not because he needed a book, but because he needed a beginning. Inside, he wandered until he found a thin volume titled The Poetics of Space. He remembered reading it in college and not understanding a word. Now, thumbing through its yellowed pages, he found passages that felt like home. The house shelters daydreaming. The house protects the dreamer. The house allows one to dream in peace. He bought it. No assistant, no first edition, just the book. Back home, he began marking pages. Not highlighting. He hated how final that felt, but with small, torn slips of paper. As if he were gently telling the book, "This part saw me." That night, he sat in his study, bathed in the soft golden haze of the setting sun, and opened his notebook again. He wrote a single line. "Silence is the only place where truth isn't afraid." And then another. "I think Einstein was never trying to explain the universe. I think he was trying to feel it." He closed the notebook and stared at the clock again. It looked back with no urgency, no demand, just presence. Then, softly, a memory returned, not of his time with Einstein, but something the old man had said. "The future always runs ahead of the soul. Our job is to slow it down just enough that people can walk beside it." For years, Elon had seen the future as a race, a destination, a hill to conquer before anyone else got there. Now, he was starting to see it differently. The future didn't need to be wrestled into existence. It needed to be invited. He leaned back in his chair and considered that. What if progress wasn't acceleration? What if it was alignment? What if being ahead meant learning how to wait? He opened his laptop instinctively, not to work, but to write a letter. Not an email, a letter. He addressed it to someone who had once worked at Tesla, someone who had left because she said she felt unseen. He had brushed it off at the time, wrapped in deadlines and metrics. But now her words echoed. "Dear Camila, you were right. I didn't see you, not really. I saw results, efficiency, innovation. But I didn't see the fire you were carrying. I didn't listen to the fear behind your brilliance. I should have. I hope, wherever you are, you kept building. And I hope you know I remember now. Elon." He sealed the letter, not knowing if he would send it. But that wasn't the point. Writing it was the point. Feeling it, owning it. The following morning, he woke before the sun again. He walked to the kitchen, made coffee without looking at his phone, and sat on the porch. The stars were still visible, though faint. The sky was a canvas halfway erased. He took a sip, let it anchor him, and then, very softly, the clock ticked. Just once. He smiled, not because something had been fixed, but because something had been felt. And then the stars disappeared behind light. And he knew. He wasn't the same man who walked into that bookstore. He never would be again. And that finally was the point. Elon Musk sat in the stillness of late afternoon, the kind that folds around you like an old wool blanket. No calls, no press, no launches. Just a quiet house and a sky turning the shade of a forgotten photograph. The mantle clock hadn't ticked again, but now it no longer mattered. Its silence had become part of the rhythm of the room, like a friend who didn't need to speak to be heard. He reached for the notebook beside him and opened to the last page he'd written, the ink still slightly faded from sunlight. He ran his finger under the line. "Silence is the only place where truth isn't afraid." Then, with deliberate care, he turned the page and began writing again, not with urgency, but with reverence. "I always thought change came through force, through pushing, through momentum. But what if it begins in stillness? What if we build not to move the world, but to hear it better? He set the pen down. The words felt right. True, like they had been waiting inside him for years, finally finding their voice through Einstein's echo. It had been nearly a week since that inexplicable meeting. Neither dream nor hallucination, neither memory nor miracle. Just real. And though the shimmer, the portal, the rupture in time had never reappeared, the encounter had continued. It rippled forward, like sound traveling through air, reshaping every corner of Elon's internal world. That evening he walked again. This time not far, just down his own block, past the same houses he'd passed for years but had never truly seen. The low fence with peeling blue paint, the porch where an old man always read the newspaper, the house with wind chimes that caught the light like they were made of crystal. He paused in front of a neighbor's garden, a mess of wildflowers and creeping vines. It looked unkempt, chaotic, but tonight it struck him as beautiful, organic, alive. He realized how much of his world had been built on control, optimization, precision, and yet the most meaningful parts, conversation, love, memory, regret, defied control entirely. They unfolded, they bloomed, and like time itself, they demanded to be witnessed, not managed. He returned home as the first stars began to claim the sky. Instead of opening a laptop, he picked up the poetics of space again, turning to a dog-eared page. We comfort ourselves by reliving memories of protection. Perhaps we speak of that which we cannot define. He closed the book and let the thought linger. Later that night, Leo came into the room, holding a drawing in both hands. "I made something," he said. Elon motioned for him to come closer. Leo climbed onto the couch and unfolded the paper. It was a strange, swirling mix of stars, houses, stick figures, and what looked like Einstein's wild hair. At the center was a clock, drawn large, its hands pointing to nowhere. "What is it?" Elon asked softly. Leo smiled. "It's us, in the middle of everything. But we're not running. We're listening." Elon looked at his son like he was seeing something sacred. "Did you draw this from a dream?" Leo shrugged. "From a feeling." He placed a gentle kiss on the boy's head and whispered, "Never stop drawing from that place." They fell asleep together on the couch, the drawing resting on Elon's chest, the house breathing with a soft, slow rhythm. And somewhere between sleep and awareness, Elon felt it again. That shimmer, that quiet curve in reality, not outside him, inside. A folding of time not measured in years, but in meaning. He dreamt of the clock, not ticking, breathing. He was standing in the courtyard again, ivy climbing the walls, the fountain singing softly. And there was Einstein, not younger, not older, just there, as if he had never left. He was seated on the same stone bench, cradling a cup of tea in both hands. "You came back," Einstein said, not surprised. "I never really left," Elon answered. Einstein nodded slowly. "Of course not. Time doesn't hold people. Meaning does." They sat in silence. Then Elon asked, "Was this always meant to happen?" Einstein considered the question. "Perhaps, but perhaps not in the way you think. The universe doesn't plan in lines. It folds, overlaps, echoes. What you experienced wasn't a lesson. It was a remembering." "A remembering of what?" Einstein smiled. "Of yourself. Before the noise, before the metrics, before the world taught you to forget." Elon looked down at his hands. "I was so sure I had to lead, that it was my job to go first, to force the path. And sometimes it is," Einstein said, "but not always through invention. Sometimes through invitation. People don't need a map, Elon. They need a lantern." Elon closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "I don't know what to do next." "Good," Einstein said. "That means you're listening." When Elon awoke the next morning, the drawing had fallen to the floor. He picked it up, studied it again. The lines were imperfect, the shapes awkward, but it had heart. It had presence. It had everything his spreadsheets and models could never contain. That afternoon, he walked into his studio, and wrote a note to his team. New priority. Project Lantern. Objective. Build something that helps people feel more, not do more. He didn't know what it would look like yet, but for once, he didn't need to. He just needed to start from feeling, and the clock ticked again. Once, then silence, the kind that holds the universe together. On the 10th day, something subtle but unmistakable changed in Elon's posture, not in the physical sense, but in how he carried himself through the world. There was less tension in the lines of his face, less compression in the space behind his eyes. It wasn't that the weight of responsibility had vanished. It never would, but it had redistributed. It no longer anchored him down, it anchored him here, in this moment, in this life. He spent that morning outside, barefoot on the dew-wet grass. The sun rose slowly, diffused by thin clouds that softened everything like a whispered prayer. Elon sipped coffee from an old ceramic mug, one of the few things in his house not designed to perfection. It had a small chip on the rim, and that made it his favorite. It reminded him that function wasn't always the point. Some things were meant to be felt, not optimized. He looked out at the sky, a blank canvas of early light, and thought again of the shimmering portal. Of Einstein sitting on that stone bench, hands wrapped around a teacup. It had all felt so impossibly real, and yet now, the reality of it no longer required proof. The impact was undeniable. That conversation had stitched something back into Elon that had long been frayed, the thread of wonder, of humility, of emotional gravity. He returned inside and walked past the clock, now resting quietly on a wooden shelf beside a framed drawing of Leo's clock dream. Its hands hadn't moved since the second tick, but the silence no longer suggested malfunction. It suggested intention, like the clock was listening, not measuring. Back in his study, he opened his notebook again, flipping past pages already filled with reflections, thoughts, and poetic fragments. Today, he wanted to write something different, not for himself, but for others. For the people who looked to him not just as a CEO, but as a symbol of momentum, a vision of the possible. He realized now that influence was its own kind of time travel. When you speak from the heart, your words don't just echo forward. They ripple back, they reach into others' pasts and reshape how they see themselves. So he began. Asterisk, to anyone who's ever felt like they had to run ahead to matter. Stop. Not forever, just long enough to feel the ground. The future will always need builders, but it also needs witnesses. Don't just build what lasts. Build what listens. Asterisk. He paused, reread it, and smiled. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was true. And in this new chapter of his life, true had become his only metric of value. Later that day, he recorded a private video message, not for press, not for a live stream, not for viral traction, just for his children. A file they could watch someday when they needed to remember not just who he was, but who he was trying to become. The camera blinked red. He looked into the lens, but more than that, he looked into the future. Hey, if you're watching this, I guess I'm not around to say it myself. Or maybe I just wanted to put somewhere safe. Anyway, I want to tell you the thing I didn't know how to say for a long time. I was scared, not of failure, but of missing it all. The little things, the quiet, the parts of life that don't ask for headlines. He took a breath, a long one. I met someone, I think, or maybe I remembered someone. A man who changed the world by asking questions, not by winning. He reminded me that it's okay to feel the weight of this life, that the heart is also a kind of engine, and if you don't tend to it, nothing you build will ever fly far enough. He reached out and stopped the recording. That was enough. That evening, he revisited the courtyard in his mind. He sat with the version of himself who had first walked through that shimmer, eager, skeptical, desperate for answers. And now he simply watched, not to fix him, but to understand him. He offered no critique, just presence. As the sky turned indigo, Elon walked to the mantel clock and touched the top gently, like greeting an old friend. And then, softly, unmistakably, a third tick. He smiled, not because the clock was counting time again, but because it wasn't. It It was marking it, like a heartbeat at rest, gently reminding him, "You are here." He sat with Leo once more, this time by the window, watching as the stars returned. The boy had fallen asleep beside him, head resting against his arm, clutching a stuffed rocket like a treasure. Elon didn't move, didn't dare. The moment was too full, and maybe that was the real lesson. That time wasn't something to manage or escape. It was something to hold. He closed his eyes and let the silence speak. And this time, he didn't need to ask what came next, because sometimes the future waits, and sometimes it listens. The 11th day began with a peculiar sense of stillness, even more profound than before. Elon woke before the first hint of sunlight, not startled by a dream or pressed by responsibility, but drawn by something subtle and magnetic. He didn't check his phone. He didn't glance at the clock. Instead, he simply sat up and watched the shadows breathe across the room as the darkness gave way to gold. He got dressed slowly. Gray hoodie, worn jeans, no shoes. He moved like someone returning to something sacred, not rushing, not rehearsing. There was no agenda for the day, but there was a presence in the air that made him feel as if something was already waiting for him, not outside, but within. He made his way to the study, and there, as always, was the clock. It sat perfectly still on the shelf, unchanged, yet entirely transformed in Elon's eyes. 3 ticks, 3 moments marked, yet never repeated. It wasn't counting forward, it was anchoring inward. Each tick a threshold, a shift, a revelation. Today, he didn't open the notebook right away. Instead, he knelt down in front of the shelf, not in reverence, not in surrender, just in openness, as if to meet the object not as a man of invention, but as a man of listening. And for the first time, he whispered out loud, "Why me?" He didn't expect an answer, but sometimes speaking the question is enough to wake something. The room remained silent, but inside him something unfolded. A memory, not his. A memory that didn't belong to time, but to meaning. He closed his eyes and saw the shimmer again, only now it wasn't a portal. It was a mirror, reflecting not the past or future, but every version of himself he had ever been and would ever become. The child with a screwdriver and broken toys. The teenager hiding in books. The young entrepreneur masking fear with numbers. The father unsure how to translate love into time. The titan of industry lonely at the peak of his own summit. And then there was Einstein, not sitting on the bench this time, but standing in a vast field beneath a sky rippling with stars. He looked up, hands behind his back, smiling. Not at Elon, but at the universe. "You're still asking the wrong question," his voice echoed, calm and amused. Elon stepped forward. "Then tell me the right one." Einstein turned and met his eyes. "It's not why me. It's what will you do with it?" "With what?" Einstein gestured around them. "With this. With presence. With silence. With the kind of understanding that can't be taught, only felt." Elon took a deep breath. "I want to do something different. I want to build, yes, but not alone. Not above. Beside." Einstein nodded. "Then begin again. Begin where they are, not where you think they should be." That was the moment the vision or memory or dream dissolved. Elon found himself once more in the study, knees to the wooden floor, heart full, eyes wet but not broken. He stood, slowly, and reached for the notebook. But this time, he didn't write reflections. He began designing, not blueprints, not schematics, but sketches of ideas that had no product to sell. Ideas that asked, how can we help people slow down? How can we remind them of wonder? Not solve problems. Hold them. He labeled the concept, Project Ether, a space for listening. It wouldn't be a machine. It wouldn't be a vehicle. It would be a place. A digital and physical sanctuary where people could come together to share presence, to meditate, to tell stories, to grieve, to create, without interruption, without measurement, without needing to be anything other than human. He imagined spaces, clean, open, with natural light, and a quiet pulse like a heartbeat that never rose above a whisper. He imagined devices that didn't vibrate, didn't notify, didn't distract, but only activated when spoken to in kindness. He imagined algorithms that didn't sort people by profit, but by shared experience. He imagined tools that asked, "How do you feel?" and "What you need today," that doesn't require fixing. And he imagined launching it not with a press release, not with fanfare, but with a single phrase. "This is not a product. It's a pause." He paused himself, then, staring at the words on the page. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. The light no longer golden, but crisp and steady. He stood and went to the window, pulling it open wide. A breeze came in, cool, honest, like a note from earth. He closed his eyes and let it pass through him. When he turned back to the room, he noticed something he hadn't before. The clock had shifted slightly on the shelf. Not moved, not ticked, just turned, as if it too were adjusting its posture to better see the light. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. It was enough to notice. That afternoon, he began voice recording entries for what he would later call the ether letters, a series of audio reflections, unfiltered and unrehearsed, to be archived and released over time. Not as wisdom, but as companionship for anyone who had ever felt alone in the noise. His first words, "Hi, my name is Elon, and I don't have all the answers, but I know how it feels to forget who you are. And I'm here to remind you, you don't have to be brilliant to be whole. You just have to be present." He ended the recording and set the device down. Then he stepped into the garden and sat in the grass beside Leo, who was building something absurd out of sticks and rocks and a deflated soccer ball. Elon didn't ask what it was. He didn't try to help. He just watched, smiling. And for the first time in a long time, watching was enough. Because for the first time, he wasn't chasing the future. He was living in the light that waits. By the 12th morning, Elon no longer felt like a man stepping away from a world. He felt like someone finally stepping into it. The noise had dulled, not because the world had changed, but because something fundamental within him had recalibrated. His internal compass no longer pointed to velocity or victory. It pointed to truth, the quiet kind, the kind most people miss because they're too busy measuring time instead of inhabiting it. He stood barefoot in his kitchen, holding a mug of coffee with both hands, watching sunlight warm the tiles. The mantel clock remained where it had always been, silent, dignified, unchanged on the outside. But to Elon, it was now something closer to a companion. He didn't need it to tick. Its presence alone had become a kind of sacred pulse. A reminder that time's true gift isn't movement, it's memory and meaning. That morning, Leo came downstairs holding a box in his arms. It was taped on all sides, lopsided and clumsy, with Project Ether scrawled in blue marker across the top. Elon raised an eyebrow. "You made something?" he asked. Leo nodded with the solemn pride of a child unveiling a masterpiece. "You said it was about listening, right?" "I did." Leo set the box on the table, untapped the top flaps, and pulled out a tangle of wires, paper cups, and a pair of walkie-talkies duct taped to what appeared to be a colander. Elon watched as Leo explained each part: a thought receiver, a quiet filter, and something he called a heart translator. "It doesn't work yet," Leo admitted, "but it's supposed to help people hear stuff they didn't know they needed to say." Elon stared at his son, this brilliant, sincere little human who, without a degree or a lab or an investor, had captured the essence of everything he himself had been trying to build for years. "That's beautiful," he said softly. "You made ether real." Leo shrugged. "It just needs a better battery." Elon laughed, deep, full-bodied, unguarded. The kind of laugh that made his eyes water slightly. And then he hugged his son, longer than usual, tighter than necessary. Later that day, Elon returned to the courtyard in his mind. It had become a kind of sacred place, always there behind his eyes, accessible not through devices, but through stillness. He saw the ivy, the fountain, the light shifting across the stone. And he saw Einstein again, this time not speaking, not gesturing, but simply sitting, eyes closed as if meditating. Elon sat beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. And then Einstein said, without opening his eyes, you're not here for answers anymore." "No," Elon replied. "I'm here to remember." Einstein opened one eye and smiled. "Good. Then ask me nothing." Elon nodded. "Then just sit with me." So they did. Time did not pass there, not the way it did in the world of clocks and screens. Instead, it unfolded, like a poem slowly revealing its last stanza. Eventually, Elon spoke again. "You said before that legacy is the story others tell about you. But I don't care about that anymore." "Then you're finally free," Einstein replied. "I want to live in such a way that my children never need to wonder who I was, that they never need to guess what mattered to me." "Then show them," Einstein said simply. "Not in words, in pauses, in the way you hold silence, in the way you look at them when they speak." Elon closed his eyes. "I used to think time was my enemy." Einstein chuckled. "Time isn't your enemy. It's your audience." Elon opened his eyes. "Then I want to perform something worth remembering." "You already are," Einstein said. When he came back to the room, back to the world, Elon didn't feel like he'd left a dream. He felt like he'd returned from a pilgrimage. He sat down at his desk and began drafting a letter, not to investors, not to his board, not to media, but to himself. Or maybe to the version of himself that first walked into that antique bookstore, still carrying the pressure of having to prove. You don't have to hold the universe together. You just have to hold yourself with grace. Let go of the noise. Return to wonder. Speak less to impress and more to invite. You are not a machine. You are not an icon. You are a man, and that is enough. He signed it, then folded it, then placed it inside the clock, not to hide it, but to give it a home. That night, after the stars arrived without ceremony, Elon and Leo lay on a blanket in the backyard, counting constellations. Not as astronomers, as wanderers, as witnesses. "I think stars are like thoughts," Leo said. "They're always there. We just don't see them until it's dark." Elon looked at him and whispered, "You're going to change the world." Leo frowned. "I don't want to change it. I just want it to feel more like home." Elon swallowed the lump in his throat. "Then that's the best change of all." As Leo fell asleep beside him, wrapped in quiet, Elon stared up into the sky and smiled. The clock remained silent in the house behind them, but in his heart it ticked, one beat at a time. The days no longer blurred together. Each morning had its own hue, its own sound, its own subtle invitation to notice. That was the word Elon had begun to use most often now, notice. It replaced so many others, optimize, analyze, scale. Where before he'd seen the world as a series of systems to be mastered, he now saw it as a field of moments waiting to be acknowledged. And in that shift, something extraordinary happened. He stopped feeling like he was running out of time. On the 13th morning, he woke slowly, not from sleep, but from a dream so delicate he wasn't sure if it had even ended. In it, he was a boy again, sitting beneath a large tree with a sketchpad on his knees. The sky above him was crowded with stars, even though it was daytime. A single voice, not Einstein's this time, but his own, whispered, "Build what you wish had existed when you were too small to be heard." He carried that phrase with him through breakfast. Leo sat across the table, eating cereal one loop at a time, humming a song he didn't know he was humming. Elon watched him, not with the gaze of a parent keeping order, but with the eyes of someone who had finally understood the sacredness of watching. Leo looked up. "Why are you smiling?" "Because I think you remind me of something important." "What's that?" "How to see." Leo shrugged, not sure how to respond, and went back to his cereal. Later that day, Elon returned to the notebook, the one he now considered more valuable than any prototype he'd ever sign off on. He opened to a blank page and titled it with care. A manifesto for the invisible. He didn't write it in one sitting. He wrote it in pieces, with pauses, with breath. The world does not need louder voices. It needs quieter rooms. The future will not be shaped by those who shout. It will be shaped by those who stay, who hold eye contact, who hold space. Innovation is not in velocity. is in the courage to slow down enough to feel again. Make things that last, yes, but more importantly, make things that listen. He read it back and felt a peace settle in his chest, not because the words were perfect, but because they were honest. And honesty, he had come to understand, was the rarest kind of architecture. That afternoon, he revisited Project Ether. The team, hand-picked small and told explicitly that deadlines were suspended, had begun prototyping not software or hardware, but spaces. They were experimenting with environments that responded to emotion, not input. One prototype, called the Resonance Room, used ambient light and spatial acoustics to create a mirrored emotional environment. Another, still in concept phase, imagined a digital companion that didn't suggest products or push reminders. It asked you once a day, what made you feel something today, and did nothing more than hold the answer. Elon smiled as he reviewed the sketches. These weren't tools. They were companions, mirrors for the soul in an age of constant noise. And what amazed him most wasn't the elegance of the designs, it was how much of Leo he saw in them. The wonder, the softness, the courage to imagine without demanding a result. He remembered what Einstein had said, people don't need a map, they need a lantern. And now, Elon understood what the lantern was made of. Presence, stillness, love. That evening, Leo asked him a question that caught him mid-thought. Do you ever wish you weren't famous? Elon looked up, surprised by the weight of the question from such a small voice. Sometimes, he admitted, it makes it hard to just be a person. Leo nodded. I think I'd still like you if you weren't. Elon smiled, and something inside him quietly broke open, something that had been armored for too long. I think I'd like me more too. They sat together on the back porch again, as the stars began their quiet dance across the darkening sky. No telescope, no apps, just skin against wood, eyes against sky, heart against time. Do you think stars talk to each other? Leo asked. Elon thought about Einstein, about the courtyard, about the shimmering stillness. I think maybe they listen to each other, he said. That night, Elon stood alone in his study for a long time. The mantel clock was still as always, but in the reflection of its glass dome, he saw not himself, but a boy with wild ideas and a notebook full of inventions that would never be sold. The boy looked tired but hopeful. Elon reached out and touched the glass, not to reset the hands, but to honor the stillness. He didn't need it to move. He just needed it to remain. The 14th day felt heavier, not in a burdensome way, but in the way a morning feels just before it rains. The air held something unspoken, and Elon, attuned now to the subtle cadences of presence, felt it immediately. It was in the quiet pacing of his thoughts, in the way his fingers lingered longer than usual on the rim of his coffee mug, in the soft way Leo had said, "Good morning," without asking a single question. The world was speaking in hushed tones, and Elon knew better now than to try and talk over it. He spent most of the morning in the garden, not doing anything in particular. He walked the perimeter slowly, stopping to examine the way sunlight hit a leaf, or how a single dandelion puff clung to its stem despite the breeze. In his former state of mind, none of this would have registered. These were details meant to be filtered out, not taken in. Now they were everything. When he returned inside, he sat at the desk in his study and stared at the mantel clock. 3 ticks, 3 moments. Each one had corresponded to a turning point in this internal pilgrimage. And yet, the clock still refused to function in any way recognizable to engineering. It had become the inverse of a machine, its purpose not to measure time, but to free him from it. He opened the notebook again and wrote one line in bold. What if the next revolution isn't in speed, but in stillness? Below it, he expanded. We move fast because we're afraid of what we might feel if we stop. But what if stopping is the only way to evolve? Stillness isn't the absence of action. It's the refinement of intention. It's the clarity that comes before creation. It's where meaning settles when the world gets quiet enough to receive it. He didn't need to write more. The thought stood on its own. That afternoon, he joined Leo in the garage, where the boy had begun constructing what he insisted was a real ether box. This version was made out of a cardboard Amazon delivery box, a handful of buttons removed from an old keyboard, a broken remote control, and a silver mixing bowl duct taped to the top, like an antenna. Elon knelt beside him, not to guide but to witness. Leo explained the design. This button turns on listening mode. This one turns off everything else. Elon smiled. And what does the big one do? Leo looked serious. That one's for emergencies. It makes the world go quiet when your heart gets too loud. Elon said nothing. His throat caught. He just nodded. They sat on the garage floor together for a long time, side by side. At one point, Leo leaned his head on Elon's shoulder. Do you think the real ether will help people feel like this? I hope so, Elon whispered. Then don't stop. That evening, Elon revisited the courtyard in his mind, almost out of instinct. The vision had become less like a dream and more like a conversation with the self he had long silenced. This time, he found Einstein not sitting, not speaking, but tending to a small plant growing between the cobblestones. You garden here? Elon asked. Einstein smiled without looking up. Even time needs tending. Elon sat beside him, watching the simple act unfold. I feel like I'm building something that doesn't belong to the world yet. Einstein looked at him then you're doing it right. But what if it never catches on? What if people want noise, not quiet? They will, Einstein said, at first, but only because they've forgotten the language of stillness. Remind them, gently. Elon exhaled, the weight in his chest lifting just enough to breathe more fully. I'm afraid, he said. Of course you are, Einstein replied. That means you're paying attention. Elon laughed quietly. You never stop being a physicist, do you? I stopped being only a physicist long ago, Einstein said. That's why I'm still here. When the courtyard faded, Elon was sitting in the grass again, watching Leo sleep beneath a tree with his cardboard creation resting like a crown beside him. The stars had come early that evening, and they didn't blink, they breathed. That night, Elon couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, from clarity. He returned to the study and lit a single candle. He placed it on the table beside the clock, then sat and stared at the flame. And he spoke, not to Einstein, not to the clock, not to the house, but to the part of himself that had once been buried beneath ambition. I forgive you, he said softly. For what? A voice inside him asked. For thinking you had to save the world alone. He watched the flame flicker. I forgive you, he repeated, for forgetting that you were a person first. He leaned back, for measuring everything except what mattered most. And then, after a long pause, I'm ready. The clock didn't tick. The flame didn't flicker. Nothing moved. And yet, everything changed. By the 15th day, the silence no longer startled him. It didn't feel like something missing. It felt like something finally present. There was a clarity that came only from having stripped away everything unnecessary, everything performative. Elon had entered a new cadence of living, where each moment carried more weight not because it was louder, but because it was no longer competing with everything else. He rose early again, not from obligation, but because he wanted to watch the sun climb into the sky. Not through the tinted windows of a car, or from behind the blue light of a screen, but from the earth, barefoot on cold wood, holding a warm mug and nothing else. It had become a ritual, this return to stillness. Each morning was a gentle act of reclamation. Leo slept in. The boy had stayed up late the night before, not because of games or screens, but because they had been drawing together, Elon with charcoal, Leo with markers. They had made constellations on paper, not accurate to any known sky, but meaningful to them. One cluster of dots and lines Leo had named the listeners. Elon asked him why. Because they're always there, watching, waiting for someone to say something real. Elon hadn't answered. He couldn't. His throat had closed with emotion. Instead, he nodded and kept drawing. That morning, Elon returned to the study and opened the notebook to a new page. Across the top he wrote, "Real things don't rush." He paused, let the silence fill the space between the words and his breath. Then continued, "It's not the speed of a rocket that makes it powerful. It's the stillness of the silence right before it launches. That's what people forget. That silence isn't emptiness. It's readiness. He closed the notebook and placed it beside the clock. The timepiece was still silent, still resting like a monk in meditation. Elon didn't need it to move. Not anymore. It was a monument now, not to time past, but to time honored. That afternoon, he met with the Ether team again, not in a boardroom, but in the backyard. He'd set up a large whiteboard under the open sky, and chairs circled it like campfire stones. It was unorthodox, unstructured, and exactly what was needed. We're not building software, Elon told them. We're designing space, inside and out. The team listened with attention he hadn't seen in years, not because he was commanding it, but because he was inviting it. There was no keynote, no pitch deck, just sketches, words, feelings, the kind of stuff that didn't fit in a spreadsheet. What if, Elon said, drawing a slow curve across the board, we stop measuring success by how many people we reach and start measuring it by how deeply we're willing to sit with one person's truth? Someone asked, "Is this scalable?" Elon smiled. Wrong question. He let that hang there, then said, "The right question is it sacred?" They didn't respond with excitement or applause. They just nodded, thoughtfully, and that, more than any cheer, was the affirmation he needed. After the meeting, he stayed behind, watching as the light shifted on the lawn, drawing shadows from the empty chairs. Leo came out a little later, barefoot like him, carrying the ether box under one arm. "Want to test it again?" Leo asked. "Always," Elon said. They sat facing each other. Leo clicked one of the buttons. "Listening mode," he said with a serious expression. Elon waited. Leo tilted his head. "Now you have to say something nobody else has heard." Elon looked up at the sky, then at his son. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "Not because of what you made, but because of how you made it." Leo beamed, clicked another button. Transmission saved. They laughed. Then they didn't. They just sat there, letting the moment echo. That night, after Leo went to bed, Elon stood again in his study, hands resting lightly on the edge of the shelf. He looked down at the clock, then at the candle beside it, now melted halfway. The flicker of the flame reminded him of something Einstein had said the last time they met. A flame doesn't resist the wind. It dances with it. He took the notebook one more time and wrote, "The next thing I build won't be seen first. It will be felt. And maybe that's what building always should have been." Then he stood, walked outside, and lay on the lawn beneath the same sky he'd forgotten how to love for so long. He didn't bring a phone, didn't check the stars for data. He simply looked up, and in that space between the inhale and the exhale, he whispered, "Thank you." To Einstein, to Leo, to the boy he once was, to the silence, and the wind didn't reply. It simply passed through the trees like an answer too old for words. By the 16th morning, the quiet had taken on a different shape. It wasn't just peace anymore, it was presence, weighted and warm. Elon had grown used to walking through his days not in a hurry, but in observation. Every movement, every word, every pause between thoughts had meaning now. He wasn't tracking time, he was tracing experience. There was a comfort in this cadence, in the way his mornings began not with a goal, but with a gaze, outward toward the trees, upward toward the light, inward toward something that had always been there, but had never been given enough stillness to speak. The clock remained silent, of course. 3 ticks, 3 moments, 3 thresholds crossed. Elon no longer asked for more. He simply passed by it each day with a nod, like an old friend you don't need to greet because your presence says enough. Leo was already outside by the time Elon reached the kitchen. The boy was on his knees in the grass, drawing something in the dirt with a stick, completely lost in his own world. Elon stood at the window for a moment, coffee in hand, watching him. It struck him how easily children accessed wonder, how naturally they move between imagination and reality without needing to name the transition. Adults forget how to do that. They demand definitions where once they felt delight. He stepped outside barefoot, the grass still cool from the night. Leo didn't look up. "What are you building?" Elon asked, crouching beside him. "A landing pad," Leo replied. "For a rocket." Leo shook his head. "For thoughts." Elon blinked. "Thoughts? Yeah. Sometimes they get tired flying around all day. They need somewhere safe to land." He said it so plainly, as if it were obvious. And perhaps it was. Elon had spent his whole life launching things into space, cars, satellites, ideas. But the idea of creating something designed not to lift off, but to hold, that was new, and it was beautiful. He sat down beside Leo and helped smooth the dirt. They placed a few pebbles in a circle, carved a spiral into the center. Elon didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. The act was enough. Later that day, he walked alone for a while, not far, just around the edges of the property. The sun was high, the sky wide and cloudless. He passed the trees where he used to barely glance, now noticing how their leaves tilted in tiny angles, adjusting to drink light. Nature, like silence, didn't force its way into attention. It simply waited to be noticed. He found himself at the edge of the garden where Leo had planted a few beans in a line of pots. Most of them had sprouted now, green shoots reaching toward the sun with the stubbornness of hope. He knelt, touched the soil, felt its cool resistance. The word that came to him then was cultivate. That was what he was doing now, wasn't it? Not just in the earth, but in himself. Cultivating stillness, cultivating attention, cultivating the parts of him that had been buried under urgency and brilliance for too long. That afternoon, he entered the study again and pulled out a fresh page in his notebook. His hand paused over the paper, not from hesitation, but from reverence. Then he wrote, "The future isn't something we race toward. It's something we learn how to hold. Before we invent again, we must learn how to listen. Not to data, not to trend, to breath, to ache, to the space between things." He sat back. The page felt heavier than it looked, as if the ink itself had mass. That evening, he and Leo walked out again to the grass, where the thought landing pad still rested in the dirt. Leo added a feather to the center and declared it operational. "What do we do now?" Elon asked. Leo smiled. "We wait for a thought to land." So they did. They sat on the ground as the air cooled and the stars bled slowly into view, and for a long time they said nothing. Elon expected Leo to fidget, to ask questions, to wander. But he didn't. He just watched the sky like it owed him a secret. After a while, Leo whispered, "Do you think thoughts know we're waiting?" Elon responded with a softness he hadn't used in years. Maybe the really good ones do." They watched longer, and eventually Leo laid his head on Elon's lap and fell asleep. Elon sat motionless, hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, eyes on the stars. And in that moment, a thought did land. Not a flash of genius, not an idea for a new technology, just a phrase, a quiet knowing. This is the invention. Not the rockets, not the algorithms, not the electric revolutions. This stillness, this child, this shared silence. That was the thing he'd been trying to build all along and hadn't known how. The mantle clock would not tick again. It didn't need to. Its silence was no longer a mystery. It was the answer. The 17th morning broke with the kind of light that doesn't just illuminate, it reveals. A clarity filled the air, like the sky itself had been scrubbed clean. Elon sat alone at the kitchen table, steam rising gently from his coffee, the house still and quiet. Leo was still asleep upstairs, curled in blankets, dreaming child-sized dreams. The ether box sat on the counter beside a bowl of fruit, ordinary objects now imbued with something else. Not function, meaning. Elon didn't write that morning. He didn't open his notebook. He didn't need to. The silence around him was full enough. For the first time in his life, it felt like everything he was meant to say had already been said, not in words, but in moments. A glance, a pause, a walk through the garden without urgency, a feather resting on a circle of stones. He got up and walked to the window, pressing his palm lightly against the cool glass. The sky beyond was not special, it was simply true. Blue and open, waiting for nothing, offering everything. Later, after breakfast, Leo wandered into the study, rubbing his eyes. He looked at the clock on the shelf and asked, "Did it tick again?" "No," Elon said. Leo nodded thoughtfully. "I think it doesn't need to anymore." "Why not?" "Because it already woke you up." Elon froze, not because he didn't understand, but because he did. More than anything, in that moment, he felt the truth of it settle deep into his chest like a key, finally turning in a lock. "It did," he said. "It really did." They spent the day mostly outdoors, not doing much, just existing in the same space. They built a new version of a landing pad, this one bigger, with colored stones and small drawings placed around it like runes. Elon didn't guide. He followed. He let Leo decide where things went, what meant what. He was no longer the engineer. He was the witness. And in that witness, he discovered something he'd forgotten. Joy, not accomplishment, not adrenaline. Joy, simple, quiet, complete. As the sun dipped low, they lay back in the grass once more, heads side by side, eyes wide to the sky. Leo reached out and took his father's hand, not dramatically, just instinctively, and Elon felt the years between who he had been and who he was now dissolve in the warmth of that grip. "Can I ask you something?" Leo said. "Of course. If you could go back and meet anyone again, would it still be him?" Elon didn't need to ask who him was. "Yes," he said, "but not because he's famous." "Then why?" "Because he saw me." Leo was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think that's what everyone wants." "What?" "To be seen." Elon closed his eyes, nodded. "You're right." After Leo fell asleep that night, Elon returned to the study one last time. The candle he'd been burning had almost reached the base. The notebook was nearly full. The clock had not moved, and yet everything had. He sat in front of it, as he had so many nights before, but this time, he didn't look at it like an object. He looked at it like a mirror, a companion, a teacher. He whispered again, not in desperation, not in question, but in gratitude. "Thank you." He rose and walked to the window, opened it wide, and let the breeze come in. The room filled with the sound of leaves brushing the world into a hush. In the distance, somewhere deep in the night, a single owl called. Elon stood in that doorway of silence, not moving, not thinking, just being. And then he felt it. Not a tick, not a shift, not a shimmer, but a knowing, like a bell that rings without sound, like a truth that arrives not in language, but in light. He had spent his entire life trying to prove something. Now, he simply wanted to preserve something. And that something was not a brand, not a mission, not a legacy. It was a moment, this moment, where the future was no longer something to dominate. It was something to hold, gently, carefully, lovingly. When he finally lay down in bed, long after the world outside had gone dark and quiet, Elon placed his hand over his chest and listened, not to the ticking of a clock, but to the rhythm of a life finally aligned. The most extraordinary thing, he realized, wasn't that he had met Einstein. It was that he had met himself, and he had been worth waiting for. The 18th morning was not remarkable in the way most people would define it. There were no glowing lights, no secret technologies unveiled, no breaking news headlines. And yet, for Elon Musk, it was perhaps the most extraordinary morning of his life. Because for the first time, he wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't engineering a future or solving a problem. He was simply there, fully and without residue. He made breakfast for Leo, pancakes again, this time with blueberries shaped like stars. Leo giggled when one looked like it had a mustache. Elon didn't rush him to finish. He let the moments breathe. Let the quiet settle between words like punctuation in a poem. After breakfast, they went outside. The morning sun was soft, filtered through thin clouds, and the grass was cool beneath their feet. They sat by the newest version of the thought landing pad. Leo had updated it with a paper flag and a painted rock that read, "Welcome home." Elon asked what it meant, and Leo answered with that same wisdom he always seemed to carry in his small, bright voice. It's for any thought that's too tired to keep flying. It can rest here now. Elon touched the stone, nodded, and said nothing. What could he say? He felt like the thought himself, finally grounded, finally still. Later that morning, he returned to the study. The notebook was full now, pages and pages of reflections, sketches, fragments of feeling. He flipped through them slowly, absorbing the transformation. It was all there. Every step, every realization, every return to silence. Then he looked at the clock. It was exactly where it had always been. Brass shining in the gentle light, glass domes slightly smudged from his fingers over the weeks. 3 ticks. That was all it had ever given him. That was all it ever needed to give. Because now he understood. The purpose of a clock wasn't always to measure time. Sometimes it was to interrupt it, to break the rhythm, to give someone permission to pause. He sat in front of it, lit the final candle, and closed his eyes. I don't need more time, he whispered. I just want to live inside what I've already been given. The room was silent, and then, soft as breath, true as memory, the 4th tick. Not loud, not dramatic, just a single, perfect sound. Elon opened his eyes and smiled. He didn't check the hands. He didn't record the moment. He didn't even move, because in that instant he knew the clock wasn't broken. It had never been broken. It had simply been waiting for him. It had ticked every time he crossed a threshold of awareness. Every time he returned to what mattered. Every time he chose presence over pressure. He stood, walked to the window, and opened it wide again. The world smelled of spring, of soil and sunlight, of possibility. He breathed it in deeply, then turned and looked around the room. The study that had once felt like a war room now felt like a sanctuary. No screens were lit. No alerts blinked. Just books, papers, quiet, and the clock. He picked it up gently, carried it into the living room, and placed it on the mantel where everyone could see it. Not as decoration, as a declaration. Leo came in a few minutes later, dragging the ether box behind him. Can we try again today? He asked. Always, Elon said. They brought it outside and sat by the pad again. This time, Elon pressed the listening mode button. Leo grinned. Now it's your turn. Elon nodded. Okay. He thought for a moment, then said, I used to think the best thing I could do for the world was to build the future. Leo tilted his head. What do you think now? I think the best thing I can do is be here for it. Leo smiled and clicked the pretend button. Transmission saved. And then, without meaning to, Elon cried. Not from sadness, not from regret, from awe, from the sheer miracle of this moment, this boy, this grass, this breath. He looked at Leo and whispered, You saved me. Leo shrugged. I just listened. That night, Elon wrote one final entry in a new notebook. He titled the page, What Einstein Taught Me. And he began. He didn't teach me equations. He didn't explain space-time. He didn't unlock the secrets of the universe. He reminded me to feel it, to sit with it, to love it. He reminded me that clocks are not tyrants. They are invitations. That stillness is not stagnation. It is presence. That the most radical thing a person can do is choose to be, fully, quietly, without proving anything. And in that silence, everything changes. He closed the notebook, blew out the candle, and went to bed not as a CEO, not as an icon, not as a mind trying to shape the world, but as a man who had finally come home to himself. Final interaction. If you've made it this far, thank you. Truly. Now we'd love to know, from which city are you watching this story? And more than that, what moment in your life felt like the 4th tick? Let us know in the comments. Not for the algorithm, but to remind each other we're all still listening.